Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them. The words cut through the low hum of fluorescent lights like a switch flipping off the room, and just like that, every head turned. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. Not when the officer stepped closer, not when the cold edge of authority slipped into his voice, not even when the soft rustle of shopping bags around her faded into a tense, waiting silence. She stood in the checkout lane, one hand resting lightly on the counter, the other holding a folded receipt that trembled just enough to catch the light. It had been an ordinary afternoon, the kind she rarely allowed herself. No uniform, no radio, just a quiet trip to pick up groceries, almond milk, fresh fruit, a loaf of wheat bread. The kind of normal that felt almost unfamiliar. But now, the air had changed. You could feel it in the way the cashier froze mid-scan, in the way a woman 2 lanes over slowly lowered her phone, but didn't stop watching, in the way the automatic doors at the front of the store kept opening and closing like nothing had happened at all. Officer Daniel Hayes stood across from her, posture rigid, jaw set with a certainty that didn't ask questions, it made conclusions. "We received a report," he said, his tone controlled, practiced. "Item concealment." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been. Naomi glanced down at the receipt in her hand, then back up at him. Her eyes were calm. Not defensive, not afraid, just steady. "You might want to check that again," she said quietly. Not a challenge, not a plea, just a statement. Hayes didn't move. If anything, his expression tightened, like the idea of being wrong wasn't something he entertained. Around them, the store seemed to shrink. Conversations faded into whispers. A child's laughter from somewhere near the cereal aisle stopped abruptly, as if even that small sound didn't belong here anymore. Naomi could feel the weight of the moment settling in, the judgment, the assumption, the quiet readiness of people to believe what they were seeing without ever asking why. She shifted her stance slightly, the polished tile cool beneath her sneakers, and for a brief second, her gaze flicked past. Hayes, not at the crowd, not at the cameras slowly being raised, but at the small convex mirror mounted high in the corner of the ceiling. The kind used to see blind spots. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted but clear enough. She had seen scenes like this before, just not from this side. "I didn't take anything," she added, her voice still even, almost tired more than anything else. Hayes exhaled through his nose, like he'd heard that line 100 times. Maybe he had. He reached toward his belt, fingers brushing against the metal there, then paused, studying her more closely now. There was something in the way she held herself. Not nervous, not aggressive, controlled, observant, like she was taking in every detail, every movement, every second. "Then you won't mind stepping aside while we sort this out," he said. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Not confrontational, just measuring. Then, almost softly, she asked, "You sure you want to do this here?" The question lingered, quiet but sharp, and for the first time since he'd approached her, something flickered across Hayes's face. Brief, almost invisible, but there. Doubt. Or maybe just the beginning of it. Hayes held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that did not come with all the pieces. Then he straightened his shoulders and nodded once to himself as if making a decision he had already made before he walked in, and the hesitation vanished from his face as quickly as it had appeared, replaced again by that same firm certainty, the kind that filled the space whether it was right or wrong. And he gestured toward the open floor beside the checkout. "Lane, yes, ma'am, I am sure," he said, voice calm but edged. "Step over here, please." And the word please did not soften anything. It only made the distance between them feel more official, more final. Naomi did not move right away, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but because she was watching, the way the second officer near the entrance shifted his weight, the way the cashier's fingers hovered above the register keys without pressing anything, the way a teenager near the candy rack angled his phone, just enough to keep her in frame. She noticed all of it in a single sweep, the same way she had been trained to read a room in seconds, except this time the room was reading her. She exhaled slowly, almost quietly enough to disappear into the hum of the ceiling lights, then stepped forward exactly where Hayes had pointed, her movements controlled, deliberate, nothing rushed, nothing reactive. And that seemed to bother him more than resistance would have. "Do you have identification on you?" he asked, already reaching for his notepad. Naomi tilted her head slightly. not confused, just considering the question like it carried more weight than it should have. "I do," she answered, her voice steady. "It is in my bag." She glanced toward the reusable grocery bag sitting on the counter, the one with the bread and fruit and milk neatly arranged inside. Normal things, everyday things. Hayes followed her gaze but did not move to retrieve it. Instead, he nodded once toward the bag. "Go ahead. And get it, slowly." The word slowly stretched out between them, heavy with caution that felt practiced, rehearsed. Naomi stepped back toward the counter, the soles of her sneakers barely making a sound against the tile. She reached into the bag and carefully moved aside the loaf of bread, the plastic crinkling softly in the silence, then paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if deciding something, before pulling out her wallet. It was plain, worn at the edges. Nothing about it suggested anything out of the ordinary. She held it up slightly, not handing it over yet, just letting him see it. "Here," she said. Hayes extended his hand, took the wallet, and flipped it open without looking at her, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then narrowing, but not in realization. Not yet. More like something did not match what he expected to see. He shifted the wallet slightly, angling it toward the light, the fluorescent glow catching on the plastic of the cards inside, and for a moment his thumb hovered over one of them before sliding past it. Dismissing it without fully processing, he pulled out a driver's license instead, glanced at it, then looked back up at her. "Naomi Brooks," he read aloud, as if confirming it for the room as much as for himself. "Yes," she replied simply. He nodded again, but this time there was a faint crease forming between his brows, small, almost invisible, but growing. Behind him, the second officer stepped a little closer, drawn in by the shift in tone. "Everything checks out," Hayes said after a beat, though his voice carried less certainty now, like he was filling space rather than stating fact. Naomi watched him, not challenging, not pressing, just present, and that presence, that calm, seemed to press on him more than any argument could have. "Then we should be done here," she said quietly, not a demand, just a conclusion. Hayes did not respond right away. Instead, he looked back at the counter, at the receipt still lying there, at the items in the bag, then at the store manager standing a few feet away, Linda Carter, who suddenly looked less certain than she had a minute ago, her arms crossed tightly, her posture rigid but her eyes flicking between Hayes and Naomi like she was waiting for someone else to take responsibility for what she had started. "She said you concealed something," Hayes added, his voice returning to that firm tone, but now it sounded thinner, like it had to work harder to hold its shape. Naomi's gaze shifted briefly to Linda, then back to Hayes. "Then check the receipt," she repeated, the same words as before, but now they landed differently, slower, heavier, as if the room itself was leaning into. "Hear what would happen next." Hayes hesitated, just long enough for it to be noticed, then reached for the receipt on the counter, unfolding it with a slight crackle, his eyes scanning line by line, the seconds stretching out, each one louder than the last, until even the hum of the lights seemed to fade beneath the weight of that quiet. And somewhere near the entrance, a radio crackled faintly, distant but approaching, like something on its way that had not arrived yet. The receipt rustled softly between Hayes's fingers as his eyes moved slower now, not scanning but reading, line by line, item by item, the numbers aligning too cleanly, too completely, until the certainty he had walked in with began to thin out at the edges. He shifted his stance, just slightly, the polished floor catching the movement like a mirror, and for a moment he did not speak. Naomi watched him without interruption, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, the kind of stillness that did not come from fear but from control. Behind him, the second officer leaned in a fraction, trying to catch a glimpse of the paper, while the store manager's arms tightened across her chest, as if holding onto something that was already slipping. "Everything on here is accounted for," Hayes said finally, but the words came out quieter than before, like they did not carry the same authority they had a minute ago. Naomi tilted her head just a degree, not in triumph, not in challenge, just acknowledgement. "That is what I said," she replied, her voice low, steady, and it did not rise above the hum of the lights, but somehow it filled the space anyway. Hayes exhaled through his nose, his grip on the receipt loosening as he looked back at the bag, then at the counter, then at Linda, who now avoided his eyes entirely. her confidence replaced by something more fragile, more uncertain. "You told me you saw her conceal something," Hayes said, turning toward Linda, and this time his tone was not as firm. It carried a question beneath it, one he did not want to ask but had to. Linda hesitated, her lips parting slightly before closing again, her gaze flickering toward the watching crowd, the phone still raised, the quiet attention pressing in from every direction. "I thought I did," she said finally, the word thought hanging heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of everything that had already happened. Hayes nodded once, slow, processing, but the moment did not resolve. It only shifted, because the room had not let go of its tension. Not yet. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the entrance, where the faint crackle of a radio had grown clearer, closer, the sound threading through the silence like a distant warning. Hayes heard it too, his head turning instinctively toward the door, and for a split second his posture changed, less rigid, more alert, the way someone responds to something familiar, something routine. The radio voice broke through again, sharper now. "Unit 7, respond. We need confirmation on Captain Brooks. Repeat. Captain Brooks is not at briefing." The words cut clean through the space, and for a moment no one moved. Not the cashier, not the second officer, not even the people holding their phones. It was as if the entire store had paused on the same breath. Hayes blinked once, then again, like his mind was trying to catch up to something it had not expected. His eyes shifted slowly, deliberately, back to Naomi, and this time when he looked at her, something in his expression changed, not fully, not completely, but enough to crack the surface of that certainty he had been holding on to. Naomi did not speak right away. She did not need to. She simply met his gaze, calm, steady, the same way she had from the beginning, and the silence between them stretched, not empty, but full of realization building piece by piece. Hayes glanced down at the wallet still in his hand, then back at her face, then down again, as if something he had overlooked was now impossible to ignore. His thumb moved back to the card he had passed over earlier, sliding it free this time, holding it up just enough for the light to catch the badge printed beneath the surface, the metallic seal reflecting a sharp line across his eyes. And for a second he did not react, not outwardly, but the shift was there, subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened, and the space around him seemed to shrink. The second officer took a half step back without realizing it, as if instinct had pulled him away from something he could not yet name. Naomi watched all of it unfold, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a quiet understanding that settled deeper than either of those things. Hayes swallowed once, the sound small but audible in the silence, and when he looked back up at her, the room felt different, like it had crossed a line it could not step back from. Hayes did not speak right away, the card still held between his fingers, angled just enough for the overhead light to reflect off its surface, and in that reflection, something shifted inside him, something quiet but undeniable, like a realization arriving too late to stop what had already begun. His eyes moved from the badge to Naomi's face again, slower this time, more careful, as if he was seeing her for the first time instead of the version he had decided she was minutes ago. The store remained completely still around them. No scanners, no footsteps, no conversations. Just the faint hum of electricity and the soft buzz of that radio, still lingering in the air, repeating in the background like an echo that refused to fade. "Confirm Captain Brooks, respond." The second officer glanced at Hayes, waiting, unsure whether to step in or step back, his posture caught somewhere between instinct and uncertainty. While Linda stood frozen near the end of the counter, her earlier confidence now replaced by something smaller, something quieter. Naomi did not move. She did not reach for the card, did not correct him, did not rush the moment. She simply watched him process it, letting the silence do the work that words no longer needed to. Hayes finally cleared his throat, a small, restrained sound that felt louder than it should have been, and he lowered the card slightly, though he did not let go of it yet. "Is this current?" he asked, but the question lacked the firmness he had before. It was softer now, edged with something closer to doubt than authority. Naomi's expression did not change, her gaze steady, grounded. "You already read it," she said, not dismissive, not sharp, just factual, and that made it harder for him to push back against, Because there was nothing in her tone to resist, only clarity. Hayes nodded once, slowly, like he was agreeing with something he had just realized himself. His fingers tightened slightly around the card before relaxing again. Then he looked down at it one more time, reading the name again. The title, the department seal. Each detail now impossible to ignore. Behind him, the second officer straightened a little, his posture shifting from passive to attentive, like a line had been crossed that required a different kind of presence. Naomi shifted her weight subtly, the movement small but intentional, her eyes moving briefly toward the exit and then back to Hayes, not impatient, not eager to leave, just aware of everything around her. "You should answer your radio," she said quietly, and the words landed without pressure, but with precision. Hayes blinked once, as if the suggestion had not occurred to him until now, then reached for the device clipped to his shoulder, his hand moving slower than it would have earlier. Like every action now carried more weight than it had before. He pressed the button, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke. "Unit 7. I copy." His voice steadier than his expression, but not by much. The reply came almost instantly, sharper, more urgent. "We have been trying to reach Captain Brooks for 10 minutes. Confirm status." Hayes's gaze shifted back to Naomi again, and this time there was no misreading it, no assumption left to hide behind. Just recognition settling in piece by piece. He lowered his hand from the radio, the silence. Stretching again, but now it felt different, heavier, more defined, like the room itself understood what had just happened even before anyone said it out loud. Naomi took a small step forward, closing the space between them just enough to remove any distance that still existed. Her voice remained calm, measured, but there was something else beneath it now. Something that did not need to be raised to be heard. "You are standing in front of her," she said, and the words did not echo, did not need to. They simply stayed where they landed. And for a moment Hayes did not react, not outwardly, but the effect was immediate. His shoulders tightened, his posture shifting again, no longer squared in authority, but adjusting, recalibrating. The second officer's eyes widened slightly before he looked away, instinctively giving space. Linda took a small step back, almost without realizing it, her arms lowering from their defensive cross to her sides. Uncertain now where to place them, Hayes exhaled. Slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt different from before, less controlled, more human. He glanced down at the card one last time, then carefully extended it back toward Naomi, his movements precise, deliberate, like he was handling something fragile rather than something he had dismissed moments ago. Naomi accepted it without hesitation, slipping it back into her wallet with the same calm she had held from the beginning. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, briefly, and in that flicker the entire scene seemed to shift, not in action, but in understanding. The balance of the room no longer where it had been. Hayes opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, the words not coming as easily as they had before, because whatever he had planned to say no longer fit the moment. And for the first time since he had walked into the store, he did not have control of the narrative anymore. He just stood there, facing the weight of it, the realization settling in fully now, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to undo. No one spoke, and somehow that silence said more than anything that could have been added to it. Hayes's hand lingered in the space between them for a moment after returning the card, like he had not fully caught up to the action his body had already completed. Then he let it fall back to his side, slower than before, more deliberate, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, recalculating. Naomi closed her wallet with a soft click that echoed sharper than it should have in the stillness, then placed it back into her bag without breaking eye contact. The small, ordinary movement grounding the moment in something real, something human, and that made the shift in the room even more noticeable. The second officer cleared his throat quietly, stepping back half a pace, as if instinctively giving space to something that had just changed hierarchy, without a single raised voice. Linda stood near the counter with her hands now loosely at her sides, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a hesitation that kept her from speaking, from moving, from even meeting Naomi's eyes. Hayes finally exhaled, longer this time, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the edge it carried before, replaced by something more careful, more measured. "Ma'am." "Captain." He corrected himself mid-sentence, The adjustment small but significant, like a line being redrawn in real time. Naomi did not react to the correction, not outwardly. She simply watched him, waiting, not for an apology, not for an explanation, just for what came next, because what came next mattered more than what had already happened. Hayes shifted his weight again, glancing briefly at the receipt still in his hand before setting it gently back on the counter, aligning it with the edge as if restoring order to something that had been disrupted. It appears there has been a misunderstanding, he said, the words formal, structured, but lacking the certainty they usually carried. Naomi's gaze flickered briefly to the receipt, then back to him. It appears so, she replied, her tone unchanged, and that sameness, that consistency, made his words feel even more fragile by comparison. The radio crackled again at his shoulder, a reminder that the outside world had not paused with them. Unit 7, confirm. The voice repeated, sharper now, more insistent. Hayes reached up again, pressing the button, but this time he did not hesitate. Captain Brooks is accounted for, he said, his voice steadying as he spoke, though not fully recovered. She is present. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a simple acknowledgement, and the line went quiet, the weight of that confirmation settling into the space around them. Naomi shifted her stance slightly, her attention moving briefly toward the entrance again, then back to Hayes. You responded quickly, she said, and while the words were neutral, there was something beneath them, not accusation, not praise, just observation. Hayes nodded once, the motion small, almost reflexive. We are trained to, he answered, but the sentence trailed slightly at the end, as if he realized halfway through that training was not the issue here. Naomi let that sit for a moment, the silence returning but softer now, less tense, more reflective. Then she stepped back toward the counter, reaching for the handles of her bag. The simple act of preparing to leave shifting the entire dynamic again, because it made it clear that she was not waiting for permission, not waiting for closure. She had already moved past the point where either of those things mattered. Hayes noticed it immediately, his posture straightening slightly, not in authority, but in response, like he was trying to keep up with a moment that was already moving on without him. Captain, he said again, more certain this time, and she paused just enough to acknowledge it, her hand still resting on the bag. Yes, she answered, turning her head slightly toward him without fully facing him. He hesitated, the words not forming as easily as they once had, because whatever he said now would not undo what had already been set in motion. It would only define how he stood in it. I regret the situation, he said finally, choosing each word carefully, not rushing, not hiding behind procedure. Naomi studied him for a brief second, her expression unreadable but not closed. Then she gave a small nod, not acceptance, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. Make sure the next one does not happen, she said, her voice quiet but firm, and that was all. No lecture, no raised tone, just a single line that carried more weight than anything longer would have. Hayes nodded again, this time more fully, more grounded, like he understood that the moment was not about what had happened, but what would happen after. Naomi lifted the bag from the counter, the weight of it settling naturally in her hand, the everyday normalcy of it contrasting sharply with everything that had just unfolded. She took a step toward the exit, then another, the sound of her footsteps soft but clear against the tile, and as she moved past him, the space shifted once more, not with tension, not with silence, but with something quieter, something steadier, like the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Hayes remained where he stood, watching her walk away, not stopping her, not following, just standing in the space where his certainty had once been, now replaced by something else entirely, something heavier, something that would stay with him long after the automatic doors slid open and closed behind her, letting in the outside light that felt different now than it had before. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and the outside light spilled across the polished floor in a thin, bright line that Naomi stepped through without hesitation, the air beyond the store warmer, quieter in a different way, like the world outside had not felt the shift that just happened inside. She adjusted her grip on the grocery bag, the weight of it settling naturally against her side, and for a moment her pace slowed, not from uncertainty, but from awareness. She glanced briefly at the reflection in the glass as the doors closed. Behind her, her face calm, composed, but her eyes carried something deeper, something that did not come from the store, but from years of moments like it, layered, unspoken. She exhaled once, steady, then continued toward the parking lot, the faint sound of traffic in the distance blending into the rhythm of her footsteps. Inside the store, the silence did not break right away. It shifted, softened, but lingered. Like the space itself was still catching up, Hayes remained near the counter, his gaze fixed on the entrance long after Naomi had disappeared from view, his hands resting at his sides, no longer occupied, no longer certain. The second officer stood a few feet away, posture straighter now, but quieter, waiting, unsure if anything needed to be said. But knowing something had already been learned, Linda moved first, her steps slow, cautious, as she approached the counter again, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge as if grounding herself. "I did not mean," she started. But the sentence faded before it found its end, because intent no longer carried the same weight it had a few minutes ago. Hayes did not respond immediately, his attention shifting from the door to the receipt still lying neatly on the counter. He picked it up again, not because he needed to read it, but because it was something tangible, something he could hold while everything else settled. "What you meant does not change what happened," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, but clearer, and it did not carry accusation, just fact. Linda lowered her gaze, her shoulders dropping slightly as if the room had become heavier. The second officer glanced between them, then toward the entrance. Again, the echo of the moment still present in the air. Hayes folded the receipt once, carefully, aligning the edges the same way he had before, then placed it back down, his movements slower now, more deliberate, like each action was being measured. The radio at his shoulder remained silent, but its presence felt louder than before, a reminder of the voice that had cut through everything, of the title that had shifted the ground beneath him. He reached up and unclipped it for a moment, turning it over in his hand, studying it like it held answers it did not, then clipped it back into place. His posture straightened slightly, not returning to what it was, but adjusting to something new, something less rigid, more aware. "We should clear the scene," the second officer said quietly, and Hayes nodded once, the words practical, but the moment behind them anything but. They moved with quiet efficiency, not rushed, not tense, just steady. As the store slowly began to breathe again, the cashier resumed scanning items, the soft beep returning like a heartbeat restarting. Conversations picked up in low tones, but the energy had changed. The looks exchanged were different now, less curious, more thoughtful, as if everyone present had witnessed something they could not fully explain. Outside, Naomi reached her car, setting the grocery bag gently on the passenger seat before closing the door. She paused for a second, her hand resting on the top of the car, the metal warm under her palm, and she looked out across the lot, her gaze distant but focused, not replaying the moment, not holding on to it, just letting it pass through her the way she had learned to do. Then she opened the driver's side door and slid inside, the quiet of the car wrapping around her like a separate world. She placed her hands on the steering wheel, steady, grounded, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, not in relief, just in acknowledgement. Then she opened them again, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking space, the tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt, carrying her forward, away from the store, away from the moment, but not away from what it meant, back inside. Hayes stood near the front for a second longer, watching the automatic doors open and close as customers moved in and out. His reflection faint in the glass, not as sharp as before, not as defined, but still there. He adjusted his stance, squared his shoulders, but not in the same way, not with the same certainty. This time it came with something else, something quieter, something that would stay long after the shift ended, long after the paperwork was done, long after the details faded. Because some moments did not end when the scene cleared, they followed, they stayed. They changed the way the next one would be handled. And as Hayes finally turned away from the entrance, moving back into the store with measured steps, the space behind him no longer felt the same as it had before, not because anything visible had changed, but because something unseen had settled into it, something that would not be undone. The road ahead stretched out in steady lines as Naomi merged into traffic, the rhythm of the city returning in small, familiar pieces, a stoplight turning from red to green, a pedestrian stepping off the curb with measured caution, the low hum of engines blending into a background that felt almost too normal after what had just unfolded. Her hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, not tense, not relaxed, just grounded. Her eyes scanning the road ahead with the same quiet awareness she had carried inside the store, but now it was different. Now it was hers again, not something being watched, not something being questioned, just something she owned. She drove for a few blocks without turning on the radio, letting the silence inside the car settle, not empty, not heavy, just present, the kind of silence that allowed thoughts to pass without needing to hold on to them. She did not replay the words, did not revisit the looks. She had learned long ago that moments like that did not need repetition to leave a mark. They simply stayed, in the way she stood, in the way she spoke, in the way she chose when to respond, and when to remain still. She approached another intersection and slowed, the brake light glowing softly against the pavement behind her, and for a brief second her gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, catching her own reflection again, clearer now, undistorted, the same calm expression, the same steady eyes, but behind them something deeper, something built over years, something that could not be seen in a badge or a title, something that had carried her through moments far heavier than a misunderstanding in a grocery store. The light turned green, and she moved forward again, seamless, controlled, as if nothing had interrupted her path at all. Back at the store, Hayes stood near the front register with a clipboard in his hand. Though he had not written anything on it yet, the paper blank beneath his pen, his gaze unfocused for a moment as the scene replayed in fragments, not as it had been, but as it should have been. The second officer approached quietly, stopping just within reach, not intruding, just present. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low enough to stay between them. Hayes nodded once, but the motion was delayed, like the answer came after the question had already settled. "Yeah," he said, though it sounded more like acknowledgement than certainty. The officer glanced toward the counter, where Linda now stood speaking quietly with the cashier, her tone subdued, her movements careful, like she was aware of every action being seen. "You handled it," the officer added, not fully a statement, not fully a question. Hayes looked down at the blank form on the clipboard, then back up at the store around him. The people moving again, the normalcy returning in layers. "I corrected it," he said, and even as the words left him, he knew they were not the same thing. The officer did not respond, but his silence carried understanding. Hayes shifted his grip on the pen, finally pressing it to the paper, the sound of it scratching lightly against the surface as he began to write. Each word measured, precise, not just documenting what had happened, but acknowledging it, line by line, detail by detail, the kind of report that would sit in a file, read by someone else, but understood fully only by the one who had lived it. Outside, Naomi pulled into her driveway, the engine idling for a moment before she turned it off, the sudden quiet filling the car again. She reached over to gather the grocery bag, lifting it with ease, the items inside shifting softly, ordinary, unchanged. She stepped out of the car and closed the door behind her, the sound firm but not loud. Grounding, she walked toward the front door of her home, each step steady, unhurried, and as she reached for the handle, she paused for just a second, not because of what had happened, but because of what would come next, not in the day, not in the schedule, but in the choices, in the way she would carry the moment forward without letting it define her. She opened the door and stepped inside, the space welcoming her back without question, without judgment, just as it always had. And somewhere across town, Hayes signed his name at the bottom of the report, the ink settling into the paper like a quiet promise, not to the system, not to procedure, but to himself, that the next time would not begin the same way, that the next moment, like that, would be seen differently, handled differently, understood differently. And as he set the pen down and closed the clipboard, the store around him no longer felt like the same place it had been an hour ago, not because anything visible had changed, but because he had, in a way that could not be reversed, in a way that would follow him into every call, every stop, every decision from that point forward. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. the soft hum of the refrigerator blending with the faint tick of a wall clock somewhere deeper inside. Naomi set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and began unpacking it with slow, deliberate movements, placing each item in its place as if restoring a rhythm that had been briefly interrupted but never broken. The almond milk into the refrigerator, the fruit into a bowl near the window, the bread on the counter, each motion grounded. Familiar and steady, she did not rush, did not linger, just moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of doing the same simple things after days that were never simple. Her phone buzzed lightly against the countertop, a small vibration that cut through the stillness. Without disturbing it, she glanced at the screen, the name flashing briefly before the light dimmed again. She let it buzz once more before picking it up, her thumb pressing against the screen. "Brooks," she answered, her voice calm, neutral, the same tone she carried into every call, but softer here, more personal. The voice on the other end came through sharp, controlled, familiar. "Captain, briefing started 10 minutes ago." Naomi leaned her hip lightly against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the window where late afternoon light filtered in through the glass, casting long shadows across the floor. "I know," she said, not apologetic, not dismissive, just aware. There was a brief pause. Then, "Everything all right?" The question held more than routine concern. It carried familiarity, history, the kind of understanding that did not need to be explained. Naomi glanced down at her hands, resting loosely against the counter, then back toward the window. "There was a situation," she said, choosing the word carefully, not minimizing, not expanding, just placing it where it belonged. The voice on the other end exhaled slowly. "You want to talk about it?" Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, almost unnoticeable. "Later," she replied, and that was enough. It always had been. "Understood," the voice said. "We will hold the last segment until you get here." Naomi nodded once, even though the other person could not see it. "I will be there in 15. She ended the call and set the phone back down, the quiet returning immediately. Unchanged, she reached for her keys again, then paused, her hand hovering just above them, not from hesitation, but from reflection, not on what had happened, but on what it meant moving forward, not for her, but for the people who did not have the same moment to shift the balance, the same moment to be seen differently. Her fingers closed around the keys, and she picked them up, the metal cool against her palm. Grounding, she turned toward the door again, her steps steady, purposeful, as if the next part of her day had already begun before she left the store. Across town, Hayes sat in his patrol car, the engine idling quietly beneath him, the report filed, the form complete, but the moment still present. Lingering in the edges of his thoughts, he rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just there, his eyes fixed on the dashboard for a second longer than necessary, then shifting to the rearview mirror, catching his own reflection, not the uniform, not the badge, just the face behind it. And for the first time that day, he did not look away immediately. He held it, studying it, as if trying to understand something that had always been there but had never been questioned. The radio crackled softly beside him. A new call coming in, routine, expected. He reached for it, his hand steady, but his pause before pressing the button lasted just a fraction longer than it used to. A small space where thought now existed where assumption once had. "Unit 7. Go ahead," he said, his voice clear, controlled, but quieter in a way that did not weaken it, only grounded it. The response came through, with coordinates, details, nothing out of the ordinary, but everything felt different now, not because the call had changed, but because he had. He started the car into motion, pulling out into the street with smooth precision, his eyes scanning the road, but his awareness reaching further, deeper, beyond what could be seen at a glance. Back at the house, Naomi stepped outside, locking the door behind her with a soft click. The late afternoon air brushing lightly against her skin, she moved toward her car again, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, the same calm presence she had carried through the store, through the drive, through the quiet of her home, now moving forward into whatever came next, not reacting, not anticipating, just prepared, the kind of preparation that did not come from training alone, but from experience, from moments that built on each other until they formed something stronger than any single event. She opened the car door, paused for a brief second, then looked out across the street, her gaze thoughtful, not distant, and then she stepped inside, the engine starting once more, the day continuing, not interrupted, not broken, just moving forward, carrying with it everything that had already happened and everything that would follow. The briefing room carried a different kind of silence than the store had, quieter, controlled, shaped by structure instead of shock. The low hum of the overhead lights blending with the faint shuffle of papers and the soft glow of a projector casting pale blue light across the wall, Naomi stepped through the door without hesitation, her presence shifting the room in a way that did not demand attention but received it anyway. Conversation softened, chairs adjusted slightly, eyes lifted then. Settled, not out of curiosity, but recognition. She moved toward the front with measured steps, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, the same calm she carried through the store now fitting seamlessly into this space where it belonged. A man near the table glanced at his watch, then back at her. 15 minutes, he said quietly, not as a reprimand, but as an acknowledgement. Naomi gave a small nod, setting her keys down on the table with a soft, precise sound. There was a delay, she replied, her voice even, and the room accepted it without question, because the weight of her presence filled in anything words did not explain. She took her place at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly against the surface, the cool texture grounding. Familiar. The projector flickered once as someone adjusted the slide, a map appearing, lines and markers outlining the next case, the next situation, the next moment that would require attention, precision, judgment. She glanced at it briefly, then looked up at the room, scanning faces, reading posture, energy, the way people carried themselves, the same way she had in the store. But here it was expected, here it was part of the role. Continue, she said, and the briefing resumed, voices steady, details unfolding, times, locations, procedures, all the pieces aligning into something structured, predictable in a way that the store had not been. But even as she listened, something beneath the surface remained, not distraction, not disruption, just awareness, the kind that stayed with her now in a sharper form. Across town, Hayes pulled his patrol car to the side of a quiet residential street, the address matching the call that had come through minutes earlier. Nothing urgent, nothing out of the ordinary, a noise complaint, the kind of situation he had handled dozens of times without a second thought. He turned off the engine, the sudden quiet settling around him, his hand resting on the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stepped out, the evening air cooler now, carrying the faint sound of distant voices, music. Low somewhere behind a closed door, he approached the house, his steps steady, but slower than they would have been before, not hesitant, just deliberate. He paused at the edge of the walkway, looking toward the window where light spilled out onto the lawn, silhouettes moving inside, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet he did not move immediately, his gaze lingering, his awareness stretching just a little further, considering not just the call, but the people behind it, the context, the space. Between what was reported and what was real, something he had not paused to consider before. He stepped forward finally, knocking lightly on the door, the sound firm but not sharp. Waiting, the door opened after a moment, a woman standing there, her expression cautious but not defensive. "Can I help you?" she asked. Hayes nodded once, his posture relaxed but attentive. "We received a call about noise," he said, his voice calm, measured, but different now, not carrying assumption, just information. The woman glanced back into the house, then back at him. "We will turn it down," she said quickly, and for a brief second, the moment mirrored something else, something earlier, something heavier, but this time it did not escalate. This time it settled. "Thank you," Hayes replied, and he meant it. He stepped back, giving space, not entering, not pressing further. The woman nodded and closed the door gently. The sound soft, final. Hayes stood there for a second, the quiet returning. But it felt different, lighter, clearer. He turned back toward his car, his steps steady, his posture grounded. And as he opened the door and slid back into the driver's seat, the reflection in the side mirror caught his face again. But this time he did not study it, did not question it, because something had already shifted, something that did not need to be revisited to be understood. Back in the briefing room, Naomi leaned slightly forward, her focus sharp as a team member outlined a scenario on the screen, her mind processing, organizing, aligning details into action. But beneath it all, there was something else, something quiet and constant, not tied to the room, not tied to the store, but tied to the space between them. The space where judgment could form before understanding, where assumption could replace observation, and she did not speak about it, did not need to, because the way she listened, the way she responded, the way she carried herself now held that lesson in place, unspoken but present, guiding each decision, each word, each pause. The room moved with her, not because of rank alone, but because of something deeper, something earned, and as the briefing continued, the light from the projector shifting across the walls, the markers on the map holding steady, the world outside moving forward without pause. The moment from earlier did not fade. It settled, becoming part of something larger, something that would shape not just what happened next, but how it happened, in ways that no report could fully capture, but every action would reflect. The room dimmed slightly as the projector shifted to the next slide, a new set of coordinates blinking onto the screen in sharp white text against a muted blue background. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone was recalibrating, absorbing the weight of what came next. Naomi's gaze remained steady on the screen, her posture unchanged, but something in the room adjusted around her, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the center of gravity had moved without anyone announcing it. A lieutenant near the far end of the table cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "We have a report from downtown," he said, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge of urgency that did not quite fit the calm of the room. "Possible misidentification, civilian complaint, escalating." Naomi did not look away from the screen right away, her eyes tracing the map, the streets, the intersections, building the situation in her mind before she ever spoke. Then she leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the table. "Details," she said, one word, measured, and it shifted the room again. The lieutenant nodded, flipping a page in his folder. "Officers responded to a call regarding suspicious behavior. Individual matched a vague description, but the reporting party has now called back, stating they may have been mistaken." He paused for a fraction of a second, then added, "The individual is still being held on scene." Naomi's eyes lifted from the screen, moving slowly across the room, reading faces, reading posture, the way people processed information when it was not clean, when it was not clear. "Name?" she asked. The lieutenant glanced down. "Marcus Hill," he replied, and the name settled into the room without reaction. Just another piece of information, but Naomi held it for a second longer, not because of who he was, but because of what the situation represented, the pattern beneath it. She stood then, her chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound, and the movement alone shifted the energy again. "Location," she said, and the lieutenant pointed to the screen, highlighting a block near the center of the map. Naomi stepped closer, her gaze narrowing slightly as she took in the details, the surrounding streets, the proximity to other calls, the flow of traffic, the variables that could not be written in a report but always existed in real time. "Who was on scene?" she asked, her voice still calm, still measured, but carrying a sharper edge now, not in tone, but in focus. "Officer Reynolds and Officer Carter." The lieutenant answered. Naomi nodded once, then turned toward the room, her eyes moving from one face to another, not seeking input, but setting expectation. "We are not repeating mistakes today," she said, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. A few heads nodded almost immediately, others straightened slightly, the weight of the statement settling into posture, into awareness. Naomi reached for her jacket draped over the back of the chair, slipping it on with a smooth, practiced motion, her mind already moving ahead of the room, already at the scene, already assessing what needed to be done before she arrived. "I am going out," she said, and there was no question in it, no need for approval, just a decision. She picked up her keys, the metal catching the light for a brief second, then moved toward the door, her steps steady, purposeful, and as she reached it, she paused just long enough to add, "Keep the channel open," before stepping out. the door closing behind her with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. Across town, Hayes sat in his patrol car at a red light, the glow reflecting faintly off the windshield, his hands resting at 10 and 2, not out of habit, but out of intention. The radio crackled again, the same call, the same location, the same situation. His eyes shifted to the display, then back to the road. And for a second he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he was aware of what the call could become if handled the wrong way, aware of what it had almost been earlier that day. The light turned green, and he pressed the gas, the car moving forward smoothly, his mind already adjusting, already preparing, not just for the call, but for the space between what was reported and what was real. The distance that had once been filled with assumption, now filled with something else, something slower, something more deliberate. As he turned onto the next street, the siren of another unit echoed faintly in the distance. Not urgent, not escalating, just present. And for the first time that day, the sound did not blend into routine. It stood out, a reminder, a marker of how quickly a moment could shift. Back outside the station, Naomi stepped into her car and started the engine, the dashboard lighting up in soft tones, her hands settling on the wheel with the same steady control she carried into every space. She pulled out into the street, the city unfolding in front of her, not as a backdrop, but as a series of moments waiting to be handled, to be understood, to be seen clearly before being acted on. And as she drove toward the location, the earlier scene did not replay. It did not need to, because it had already done its work. It had already changed the way this one would begin. The street was already crowded with quiet tension by the time Naomi turned the corner, not loud, not chaotic, but held together by that thin line where uncertainty lived. Two patrol cars parked at angles that suggested control without escalation, their lights off, their presence enough. She slowed as she approached, her eyes scanning the scene before she even stopped. A man stood near the sidewalk, hands visible, posture rigid but not aggressive, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, not on the officers, not on the crowd gathering at a distance, just forward, like he was holding himself steady in a moment that could tip either way. Officer Reynolds stood a few feet from him, stance firm, shoulders squared, while Officer Carter remained slightly behind, watching, waiting, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something fragile. Naomi parked a short distance away and stepped out, closing the door quietly behind her, her presence entering the scene without force, without announcement, but it shifted the air immediately, not because of rank alone, but because of the way she moved, the way she looked, the way she did not rush, her steps measured as she approached, her hands relaxed at her sides, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "What do we have?" Reynolds turned first, his posture tightening slightly as he recognized her. Possible match to a suspicious person call. Description was vague, but he fit enough to warrant a stop. Naomi nodded once, her gaze moving to the man, Marcus Hill, his name now a presence rather than a detail. She observed him carefully, the way his shoulders held tension, the way his breathing stayed controlled, the way his eyes avoided sudden movement, not because he was hiding something, but because he was managing the moment. "Sir," she said, her voice even, directed at him now, and he looked at her, just briefly, then steadied his gaze. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone cautious but respectful. Naomi stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd him, just enough to close the distance. "We are sorting something out," she said, her words deliberate, not dismissive, not apologetic, just clear. Marcus nodded once, small, controlled, and the nod carried more weight than it should have, like he had been waiting for something steady to enter the situation. Naomi turned her attention back to Reynolds. "What exactly was the description?" she asked. Reynolds glanced at his notes, then back at her. "Male mid-30s, dark jacket, standing near storefronts, possible loitering." Naomi's eyes shifted briefly to Marcus's jacket, then to the storefront behind him, then back to Reynolds. "That could be half the block," she said, not as criticism, but as fact. Reynolds hesitated, just slightly, enough to show the gap between report and reality. Carter shifted his weight behind him, his gaze flickering between Naomi and Marcus. Aware now of the shift in tone, Naomi took a slow breath, her attention returning to Marcus. "Do you have identification with you?" she asked, her voice calm. And this time the question did not carry assumption. It carried process. Marcus nodded, reaching slowly into his pocket, his movements deliberate, visible, controlled. The way someone moves when they understand the stakes of every small action. He handed over his wallet. Naomi took it, her fingers steady as she opened it, her eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping. She looked up at him again, meeting his gaze, something passing between them, not spoken, but understood. She closed the wallet and handed it back. "Thank you," she said, and the words landed differently here, not procedural, but genuine. She turned back to Reynolds. "The reporting party called back," she said, not asking, just stating. Reynolds nodded. "They said they might have been mistaken." Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, then glanced toward Carter, then back, the silence stretching just enough to make the point clear without stating it outright. "Then we are done here," she said, her voice steady. Final. Reynolds straightened slightly, the weight of the moment settling into him. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that was almost invisible, but felt like a thread being released. Naomi stepped back, creating space again, restoring the balance that had been disrupted. "You are free to go," she said, her tone calm, and Marcus gave a small nod. "Thank you," he replied, then turned and walked away, his steps measured at first, then more natural as the distance grew. Naomi watched him for a second, not tracking, not analyzing, just acknowledging. Then she turned back to the officers, her expression unchanged, but her presence carrying something heavier now, something that did not need to be explained. Reynolds shifted his stance, his posture less rigid now, more aware. Carter looked down briefly, then back up, both of them holding the moment in a way that suggested it would not be forgotten. Naomi did not raise her voice, did not extend the moment further than it needed to go. She simply said, "Descriptions matter, but context matters more," and left it there, because anything more would have been excess. Anything less would have been incomplete. She turned then, walking back toward her car, her steps steady, the scene behind her settling into quiet, not because nothing had happened, but because something had been corrected before it could become something else. And as she opened her car door and paused for just a second before getting in, the city around her moved as it always did, unaware of how close one moment had come to repeating another, and how quietly it had been changed instead. The patrol cars remained parked at the curb for a moment longer than necessary, their presence now quiet, almost reflective, as the tension that had filled the space only minutes ago dissolved into something steadier, something calmer. Naomi stood beside her car with the door still open, her hand resting lightly on the frame, her gaze following Marcus as he moved further down the block until he blended back into the rhythm of the city. Just another figure walking under fading daylight, not a suspect, not a description, just a person. She closed the car door gently, the sound soft but grounding, and leaned slightly against the side of the vehicle, her eyes shifting back toward Reynolds and Carter, both of them still near their positions, but no longer holding the same posture they had when she arrived. Reynolds adjusted his stance, his shoulders dropping just enough to show the weight of what had settled in. Carter exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the side of his uniform as if resetting himself. Neither spoke at first, and Naomi did not rush them. She allowed the silence to sit, because sometimes that was where the understanding took root, not in instruction, not in correction, but in the quiet space after. Reynolds finally stepped forward, his movements measured, controlled, but carrying a shift that was clear. "Captain," he said, his tone respectful, but more than that, thoughtful. "I saw the description and I acted." Naomi nodded once, her expression calm. "And what did you see?" she asked, not challenging, not accusing, just asking. Reynolds paused, his eyes drifting briefly toward the direction Marcus had gone, then back to her. "I saw enough to stop him," he answered, and even as he spoke, the words felt incomplete. Naomi tilted her head slightly, just enough to hold his attention. "And now?" she asked, her voice quiet, steady. Reynolds inhaled slowly, the breath filling his chest before he let it out. "Now I see it was not enough," he said, and the admission did not come easily, but it came clearly. Naomi held his gaze for a second, then nodded again, not in approval, not in judgment, just acknowledgement. Because the shift had already happened, Carter stepped forward then, his posture straighter but less rigid, his voice lower. "It could have gone differently," he said, not as a statement of fear, but as recognition. Naomi's eyes moved to him, steady. "But it did not," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than a longer explanation ever could. Because what mattered was not just what had been avoided, but how it had been avoided. She stepped away from her car slightly, closing the space between them by a small margin, enough to keep the conversation grounded. "You both paused," she said, her voice even. "That matters." Reynolds nodded once, slowly. Carter followed, the understanding settling deeper now, not as a lesson imposed, but as one realized. Naomi glanced briefly down the street again, the movement almost instinctive, then back to them. "Next time, pause sooner," she added, and there was no edge to it, no reprimand, just direction, clear and simple. Reynolds straightened slightly. "Yes, ma'am," Carter echoed softly, and the words carried weight, not from obligation, but from intent. Naomi gave a small nod, then stepped back, her hand returning to the car door handle. She opened it, the motion smooth, practiced, but before getting in, she paused again, her gaze moving between them one last time, not to check, not to confirm, but to leave something behind without saying it, something they would carry into the next call, the next decision, the next moment that did not come with clarity. She stepped into the car and closed the door, the sound final, but not abrupt. The engine started with a quiet hum, and she pulled away from the curb, the car merging back into the flow of traffic as if it had always been part of it. Reynolds and Carter remained on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the vehicle disappear down the street, neither speaking, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. Reynolds finally turned toward his patrol car, his steps slower, more deliberate. Carter followed, both of them carrying the same quiet shift, not visible, not spoken, but present, something that would not be filed away in a report or noted in a log, but something that would change the way they stood, the way they looked, the way they chose in the moments that followed. The street returned to its usual rhythm, the distant sounds of the city blending back together. But the space where they had stood held something different now, something subtle but lasting, a correction that had not needed force, a change that had not needed volume, just presence, timing, and the willingness to see what was actually there instead of what was expected. And as the last light of the day began to soften across the buildings, the moment settled into memory, not as an incident, but as a quiet turning point. The city settled into evening without announcing it, the sky fading from pale gold to a deeper blue as streetlights flickered on one by one. And Naomi drove through it with the same steady rhythm she carried all day, her hands resting calmly on the wheel, her eyes moving between the road ahead and the quiet reflections in the glass. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just motion. She slowed at an intersection and came to a stop, the red light casting a soft glow across the dashboard, and for a brief moment, everything felt still again. Not like the silence in the store, not like the tension on the street, but something quieter, something earned. She glanced at the rearview mirror, her reflection clear now, undistorted, the same composed expression, the same steady gaze. But there was something else there too, something that had not changed but had been reinforced, something that did not depend on uniform or title, something that existed long before either of those things and would remain. Long after, the light turned green and she moved forward, the car gliding smoothly into the flow of traffic. Behind her, the city continued without pause. People crossing streets, conversations drifting through open windows, lives moving forward unaware of how close one moment had come to shaping another. Across town, Hayes parked his patrol car at the edge of a quiet lot, the engine idling softly before he turned it off, the sudden silence settling around him like a pause he had not allowed himself earlier. He sat there for a second, his hands still on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead but not focused on anything in particular. Then slowly he leaned back, exhaling a breath he had been holding longer than he realized. The day replayed in fragments, not loud, not overwhelming, just present. The store, the receipt, the badge, the street, the name, the pause, each piece connecting into something larger, something that did not need to be named to be understood. He reached up and adjusted the radio on his shoulder, the small movement deliberate, then let his hand fall back to his lap, the weight of it grounding, not heavy, just real. He stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, the cool evening air brushing against his face, the faint sound of distant traffic blending into the background. He looked up briefly, not searching, just taking in the space around him, the stillness between calls, the quiet between decisions. And in that space something settled, not regret, not pride, something simpler, clearer, awareness, the kind that stayed, the kind that did not fade when the shift ended. Back on the street where Marcus had been stopped, the sidewalk was empty now, the storefront lights reflecting softly against the glass. No sign of the moment that had passed, no trace of the tension that had existed there, just the everyday rhythm of a place that had moved on, but the absence of it did not erase it. It remained in the way it had been handled, in the way it had changed before it could become something else, in the way a single pause had redirected the outcome. Naomi turned into her driveway again as the last of the daylight slipped away, the headlights cutting briefly across the front of her house before she turned them off, the engine settling into silence. She sat there for a second, her hands still resting on the wheel, not from hesitation, but from reflection, not on the events themselves, but on the thread that connected them, the space between power and restraint, between assumption and understanding, between reaction and choice. She opened the door and stepped out, the quiet of the evening wrapping around her, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of something distant and familiar. She walked toward the front door, her steps steady, unhurried, and as she reached for the handle, she paused just long enough to let the moment settle completely, not to hold on to it, but to let it become part of something larger, something that would guide what came next without needing to be spoken. She opened the door and stepped inside, the light from within spilling softly onto the threshold before the door closed behind her, leaving the outside still and unchanged. And somewhere across the city, Hayes got back into his car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, the motion smooth, deliberate, the same streets, the same calls waiting. But something within him no longer the same, not visible, not announced, just present, in the way he would look next time, in the way he would listen, in the way he would choose. And the city moved forward around them both, unchanged on the surface, but shaped in small, quiet ways by a moment that had not needed force to make its impact. Only presence, only awareness, only the decision to see clearly, even when it would have been easier not to.